Brought a Bible with you, open up to Romans 1, where we're going to be today, and feel free to pull your sermon outline out with you as well, if that helps you to follow along over the next half hour or so. So Romans was a letter written by Paul to the churches at Rome that he had never met. But I would imagine when the Romans first got there, probably the different house churches gathered together to read it. And in a city of 1 million people, there were probably about half the number of people that are here in this room who got together to listen to Phoebe read it and explain it. And this, I don't have any historical evidence of this, but I imagine at the time there was some 14-year-old there in the room who raised his hand or her hand and said, "Is this really it? Like, if this is all true, why do so few people believe it? Why are there maybe 50 or 100 of us in Rome out of a city of 1 million people that believe this is true? What do we do to explain all the people that haven't responded to the gospel?" And 2,000 years later, that objection might still be there for you. You know, maybe there was a time or a place where you experienced most people as generally believing in God, but that's probably not California in 2024. Like, what do we do with the fact that so many people have rejected or ignored or walked away from the Christian faith? How do we respond to the secularization of our country today? And what does the Bible give us as resources for thinking through those questions? That's what we're going to talk about today. Paul's going to sort of give 3 reasons why we don't respond to God. He's going to talk about sort of the suppression of the truth. That's the first couple verses. And he's going to talk about even if we acknowledge God, maybe our unwillingness to honor him or give thanks to him. And then the third reason he's going to talk about is kind of a surprising one. It's our refusal to worship God and then instead choose to worship things that we make instead. So we're going to talk about that over the next half hour or so. So let's jump into verse 18. You might remember last week, Paul says he's not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of salvation for all who believe, for the Jew first and then the Greek. So he's going to talk now about how that gospel has played out even as people have rejected it. Verse 18 says, "The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." Ungodliness, Paul seems to be thinking about how we sin against God. Unrighteousness, he seems to be thinking about how we sin against other people. But in both categories, how we sin against God and against other people, manifest themselves in the same way, that we suppress the truth as a result. This word suppress is such a vivid metaphor for pushing something down, right? Something that we know to be true, we push it down. I wish we were all at a pool right now and we could grab a big beach ball and have the fun game that you have at the pool sometime of trying to push the beach ball down. You guys ever do this? Or push a boogie board underwater. And you know that you can hold it there for a while, but as the second you sort of lose interest or you get distracted or something comes up behind you and you let go for a moment, that beach ball comes flying back to the surface, right? Or the boogie board flies up and hits your brother in the face. And that's the sort of metaphor that Paul's talking about, right? We can suppress the truth. Humans intuitively know that God is there, but we push it down. And as long as we're sort of actively pushing it down, actively using our atheistic coping skills of distraction or deflection or sort of just putting our fingers in our ears and closing our eyes and saying, no, God, no, God, we can ignore him or repress him. But that doesn't change the reality that it's there, that he's there. That's what he says in verse 19. "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them." Who's the them, by the way? Who's he talking about here? Well, there's a couple answers to that. One is he's talking about everyone, right? He's talking about Jews and Gentiles. This has been one of his major themes in the first couple chapters of Romans, and it will be in chapter 2 as well. That there is this racial discord in the Roman church, for reasons we talked about a couple weeks ago, that there was this division between the Jews and the Gentiles, and they had a tendency to look down on each other. And Paul's saying that all of you do this. As one writer said about this chapter, the most helpful thing we can do is when we read them, read we, right? We do this. This is our tendency. Not just other people out there, but this is our tendency to suppress the truth, regardless of our racial background or ethnic background or religious background. Quick side note, by the way. Matt, is the baby crying? Yeah, what a good dad. What a good dad you've been. This is the third time he's listened to this sermon. I was like, Matt, I can't believe you're going to sit through this sermon a third time. But He's got a baby to take care of. A quick side note, by the way. If we really took to heart what Paul is saying here about all of us have this tendency, it would have really changed the course of Western history over the last 500 years. Unfortunately, a lot of people in the West didn't really believe that people in all times and all places were made in the image of God and worthy of respect, worthy of being treated as co-image bearers of God. And so they talked about people in the Americas as savages, Native peoples in the Far East as savages, or as Africa as savages, people up in Britannia as savages. We had a tendency to treat people as less than what Paul is describing here. If we had taken the Bible seriously and said that what can be known about God is plain to them, and that God has shown himself to them, we would have treated people around the world with a lot more respect than we did in the West. Instead, we ignored what the Bible clearly says in verse 20, that his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. And the result of that is that we are all without excuse. That last phrase is so important, right? Because if we just say everybody everywhere can see that God exists and let's all just respect one another in some sort of multicultural utopia, we miss the point that Paul's making. He's saying that all of us have the evidence of God, and yet we haven't turned towards him. Instead, we've suppressed that knowledge of the truth. So how could Paul possibly claim that God is plain to all people? Well, he makes a couple arguments here. These are sort of the classic arguments for the existence of God. That God's eternal nature, his eternal existence and his divine nature are plain to all people. He seems to be thinking of what philosophers have called the cosmological argument and the teleological argument. And the reason I use those big terms is because I want to prove that going to seminary was worth it. You guys this might help you if you're in philosophy class one day or you want to Google it later or something. But the cosmological argument is just the argument from the cosmos. Like, why do the cosmos exist? Why does the universe exist? If you exist because of your parents, why do your parents exist? Because of their parents. Well, let's keep going backwards. Why does the earth exist? And science can give us some insight into that, but it can't give us insight to what was before that, or what was before that, or what was before that. What was before the Big Bang, right? If we want to take it all the way back, what's the first thing that caused anything to exist? Because you can't get everything when you just combine nothing and nobody. Nothing plus nobody doesn't equal everything, right? That's not how it works. Where does anything come from? This argument, Paul says, has been around since the creation of the world. Like, people have always noticed this. Now, the philosopher that we think of as moderns that popularized this was Aristotle, a number of hundred years before Jesus. Aristotle described it as the first mover, right? Who moved the first thing that set off everything that exists? Hundreds of years later, Thomas Aquinas, the Christian theologian in the 12th century, would say that first mover is a necessary being, and he has the attributes of what we think of as God, right? This is the philosophical argument for cosmology, or the cosmological argument for the existence of God. The other argument is the teleological argument. This seems to be even more what Paul has in mind here, that the world around us is so amazingly complex that it seems to imply that there was a designer. If you went into a field and you found a typewriter, you'd think someone built that. If you went and you found a book, you'd think someone wrote that. And yet our world is infinitely more complex than either of those things. Some of you guys are more science-minded than I am, and so I don't want to try to play a scientist on TV. But in getting ready for this sermon, there's been a number of things that really have just encouraged me and stood out to me. One of them is, I didn't know this, I found out this week, that astronomers think that if Jupiter was not the size it is and in the place it is, asteroids would destroy Earth pretty immediately. Like, just think about how complex that is or necessary that is. Or the fact that water is the rare molecule that is denser in its liquid form than in its solid form. It's very rare, and yet if that wasn't the case, all the icebergs would immediately sink to the bottom of the ocean, freeze the Earth from the bottom up, and we'd all be dead, right? And there's thousands of these things, right? That if anything was changed just a little bit, life would not exist on Earth. And so people have looked around the world, Paul says, from eternity past and said, someone had to make this possible, right? Someone had to make the things happen that could cause life to exist in this way. By the way, if you want to chew more on the teleological argument, because it's worth thinking about for your own faith, I would encourage you to turn to a book called The Language of God by Francis Collins. Collins is a Christian, and he's a former head of the Human Genome Project and the National Institute of Health, but also talks about how DNA doesn't undercut his belief in a creator, but actually encourages him towards it. And so if this is something you want to wrestle with more, Collins' book is great. Also, I'm going to put Greg on the spot here. Greg, who read scripture for us a few moments ago, is one of our elders, also a science teacher. If you want to chew on some of the science and faith discussions, Greg would love to talk with you about those. Right, Greg? Yeah. And I would too, and I would love to chew on these with you as well. Now, these aren't the only arguments for the existence of God. These just seem to be the ones that Paul is referring to here. There's also the argument from desire, right? If we have a sense, this is my favorite one, C.S. Lewis popularized it. If we have a sense of thirst, we can assume water exists. If we have a sense of hunger, we can believe food exists. If we have a sense that we're made for another world and something beyond this current world, then it's reasonable to think that there's an object for that longing or that desire. There's also the argument for morality. Why is it that we feel a sense of shame or a sense of guilt? Why is it that we have a sense that there's something that is going to judge us or something that we've done wrong? Like, where does that come from? That's the argument for morality. There's also the argument from beauty, which is a little more positive. Like, why is it that we find that we want to worship something, or we want to give credit to something, or we find things compelling, things that don't have necessity in this life, but we just find the beauty of a sunset so compelling that argument from beauty can point us towards a creator. And there's more as well, but these seem to be the ones that Paul has in mind here. He says that these arguments for the existence of God show us not just that he exists, but maybe more importantly, show us that we're without excuse for why we haven't turned to him in worship. Now, I understand that you could say, even if I grant that these arguments for God's existence are compelling, they don't bring me all the way to Jesus, right? Some of the most compelling arguments for the existence of God have been made by Muslims or by Jewish people or by Greek philosophers like Aristotle or Maimonides, or a lot of the best cosmological arguments come actually from Muslim philosophers. Like, this doesn't bring us all the way of what we would need to know. And that's true. Paul says that. He says, what can be known about God, that's in verse 19, we know from observing the world. But that's just natural revelation. We also need special revelation, right? We need God to reveal himself to us through Scripture and through the person of Jesus Christ. All right. So you might say, Bob, I agree with that. I think God does exist. Safe place, you're in church, that's fine. But there's more to it than just acknowledging the reality of God. Just a couple quick numbers from a Pew Research study that came out this week. 90% of Americans believe that God exists. That's the current number as of this summer's survey. Now, of that sounds great, right? 90% of Americans believe God exists. Here's the other survey that came out this week. 15% of Americans attend worship on a regular basis. So what about that 75% that's the vast majority of our country, right? Well, why is that? Why is there... Now, I understand. There's lots of reasons why people go to church, don't go to church, and there's physical reasons and disability reasons and social reasons and lots of reasons. But there's another reason that Paul narrates in this verse, in verse 21. It's that there's a lot of people who acknowledge that God is there, but refuse to honor him or thank him. This is verse 21. For although they knew God, this whole sermon could be on that phrase, by the way, because think about that. He just said they suppressed the knowledge of truth, that God's there. And then this is verse 21. Although they knew God, right? So they knew, but they didn't know, right? They knew, but they didn't know. Although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Yeah, wow. Why is it so remarkable? Why is it so significant to fail to honor and to thank God? Why is that something that we really need to grab hold of? Is God just petty? Like, is God like an aunt who's like, if you don't write me a thank you note, I'm not giving you any more socks? Like, thank you notes or no more socks, right? Is God that preoccupied with us honoring him and thanking him that he insists on it, or he won't show himself to us? That doesn't sound encouraging or worshipful. That sounds vindictive, I suppose. No, it's about way more than the act of us just saying thank you. It's about who we're putting at the center of the universe. Like, do we say that God is worthy of honor and thanks? Or do we put ourselves in the center of the universe and say everything revolves around us? Because Paul says that when we fail to honor and thank God, we become futile. That word futile is so important because it means that we stop the process, right? That's what futility is. It's something that's terminated, that's stopped prematurely. We close off this worship and we turn it inward at ourselves. We put ourselves in the center of the world rather than God. We become cosmic plagiarists, as one writer said. We take what God has done and we scratch out his name, we put our name on it. We say, yep, that's my work. Right? That's my work, not God's work. We insist on putting ourselves at the front rather than God. And the result of that is that our minds are affected, right? We become futile in our thinking, and our hearts are affected. Our hearts are darkened. Now, I don't want to say that somehow irreligious people or atheists are less smart. That's not his point when he says that their minds are futile. There are many very, very brilliant atheistic people or agnostic people or people of other faiths. I'm very grateful for the things they invent and create and the ways that they make roads run well and all that sort of stuff. We're talking about mind in a more complex way than that. We're saying their minds are futile, our minds are futile, apart from God, in the sense that our reasoning doesn't bring us to what is true about God, but instead it tells us a story that we want to hear about ourselves. We give ourselves credit that God should receive. We become futile. We turn it inwards to ourselves. And the result of that takes place in the heart. Right? It becomes darker and darker and darker. Right? The more we give ourselves credit, the more we block out the light of God's credit, the darker the room becomes internally. Aren't you so glad you braved the storm to hear all this sad news? Romans is a book of the good news of the gospel, but to get to the good news, you got to go through the sad news, and that's where we are today, right? Now, the last part of the message, the last part of the passage, I think is my favorite part. I think it's the most beautiful part and it's the most surprising part. Because we think that the story's kind of over here, right? Like, well, we suppress the knowledge of God and we refuse to honor him and thank him. That's kind of the end of religious activity for some people. And Paul says, no, it actually isn't, right? Because that beach ball is going to pop out of the water somewhere. That boogie board is going to pop out of the water somewhere. You can't hold it down forever. We are made to worship, right? We're made to give credit, ultimate credit to something. And Paul says in verse 22, claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. You know what Paul's saying? Idolatry is a great way to suppress worship. Idolatry is a great way to get out of worshiping God. Because your body, your heart, your soul is going to worship something. It's going to make something the ultimate thing, and you got to let that steam out somewhere. So let it out in forms of idolatry. That's what we do. Now, I want to be clear about what idolatry is here for a second. Because some of us think of idolatry and we think of going to the Getty Museum and seeing stuff the ancient Mesopotamians made, or we think about, maybe what the Egyptians had in their altars, and we think, isn't it so ridiculous that they would make a bronze statue of a cat and worship a cat? I mean, if an animal is a god, it's definitely not a cat. So, isn't this ridiculous? But as Paul will say in Colossians and in 1 Corinthians and elsewhere, it's not, you don't have to make a figurine of it for it to be an idol, right? We make idols out of all kinds of created things that aren't figurines. At least the people who made figurines out of it were being honest about it. A lot of us just worship idols of our own making. We don't make a statue of them, but we sure live for them. David Foster Wallace, the great American novelist, who was very much not a Christian, but I think was really right about this, that humans are made to worship. This is a little bit of a longer quote, but I think you guys are smart and you can stick with it. He said, in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. An outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship, not great theology, Mr. Wallace, but we'll go with it, is pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they're where you tap real meaning in life, then you'll never have enough. Never feel you have enough. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, you'll always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you'll die 1,000,000 deaths before they finally plant you. Worship power, you'll feel weak and afraid. You'll want even more power over others to keep the fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, and you'll end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out, and so on. What I wish Wallace would have seen before he died was that desire for worship is not some sort of evolutionary mistake or some sort of glitch in our DNA or some sort of result of just being in society together. It's a result of how you and I were made, right? Going back to Lewis's point, if we're made to worship, doesn't that infer that there's someone there to worship? Doesn't that infer that is intended to go somewhere? And if we refuse to let it go anywhere, it's going to find somewhere else to go. It's going to find an unhealthy relationship with our kids where we worship them and are cruel to them because they won't match what we want out of them. It'll go into our desire to be longed for or desired by a partner or a new partner or a new partner. It'll go itself into a career, and we'll try to make being a teacher or a business person or a pastor the ultimate thing about our identity and then be crushed when it's taken away. Right? We're all going to worship something. So the question is, do you worship something that's going to fall under your weight like a poorly made chair? Or do you worship the only thing that it was actually made to absorb it? The God of the universe. Not a cruel or vindictive God, but a God who loves you, who didn't wait for you to climb the mountain to get to him, but who came close to you in the person of Jesus Christ. And who didn't leave you in your futility and your futility of your mind and the darkness of your heart, but instead came near, died the death you and I deserved, and came back from the grave to bring us before his Father forever. Well, what do we do with this, right? Paul says that we have a choice, right? Either we can sort of go on with this futility, we can persist in our futile thinking, or we can turn our hearts through the gospel to the maker that is deserving of our worship. We're going to take communion here in a couple of minutes. And as we take communion, I hope that this is a time of recommitment for you, where you say, God, I want to remember rightly. I want to remember what's true about you and about me and about the world. I don't want to be distracted or suppressing or pushing this beach ball of unbelief under the water, because it's going to pop back up, right? Like, it's going to come out. Like, your worship's going to come out somewhere this week. God, I want it to come rightly towards you. Now, I want to acknowledge, too, that while the belief in the existence of God is self-evident to all people and all places, it doesn't make it easy. And for some of you, belief in God is a very difficult thing. Maybe because you came from a family where that was not natural, and so this is a little bit of a second language for you. You're kind of coming into it later in life. Or maybe there's doubts that you're wrestling with, and you just really struggle with this. Maybe it's science and faith stuff. Maybe it's something else. I would love to sit with you and talk about that, because I probably am weaker in faith than a lot of you guys. And I would love to be able to wrestle with these things with you sometime this week. All right, let's close our time in prayer. God, I'm grateful for my friends who are here, who are sources of faith for us in the body, that they can point us to where our worship goes, where it should go, where it needs to go. God, help us to be a place and a community of encouraging one another in faith. I pray for my friends who are here, who have worship that's going into the wrong places, towards the wrong ends, towards themselves, towards things that were created. God, I pray that in your goodness and through your word and through the gospel, they would find the place their worship belongs in their relationship with you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.